Hi, everybody. This is Arlo Gilbert, co-founder and CEO of Osano, a leading data privacy management platform. And you are listening to the Privacy Insider Podcast. This show explores the past, present, and future of data privacy for privacy and business leaders alike, as well as anyone who wants to keep privacy top of mind. Hey, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Privacy Insider Podcast. My name is Arlo Gilbert. I am the co-founder and CEO at Osano, and I am your host today. We're going to be talking about all things privacy, what's happening in the world, what you should be paying attention to. And today we're joined by a very special guest. Her name is Rachael Ormiston, and she is an Osano team member. She is our head of privacy, and she's the one that's ultimately responsible for setting most of the direction for the way that our products will engage so that regulators and customers alike all get a lot of value. Rachael is going to be here today to talk a little bit about the federal privacy regulations. We're going to dish on a little bit of news, and maybe we'll say the AI word at some point in time. Rachael, welcome. I'm delighted to have you, and welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here and talking with you about all things privacy.
Yeah. So I think like we've done with our prior episodes, one of my favorite things to talk about is how somebody got into privacy, because privacy is a very strange category. Some people came in as attorneys. Some people came in as ops people who are trying to do lots of different things and somehow got handed privacy. And I imagine a lot of our listeners are in that same boat as well. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and tell us how you got into privacy? Maybe tell us how you got over to the United States, because I think everybody can tell from your Union Jack and your accent that you are not a native American.
Exactly. So like you mentioned, privacy pros don't have that linear path to becoming a privacy pro. And that was certainly the case for me. Growing up, I never thought of privacy. I never realized that privacy was a thing. There were elements of my childhood that were very much oriented on privacy, but I didn't know that's what it was until much, much later. So I grew up wanting to be a vet. I loved animals and thought that was what I would do. But as I was growing up, I realized that for me, I didn't want to deal with sick animals every day. I actually wanted to be part of a solution that helped make a broader, I became really fascinated by policy issues. And you know me as being a little bit more reserved, a little bit more considered, behaved, I hope. But when I was a teenager, I was argumentative, I challenged, I asked lots of why questions. And so I went to study law and really enjoyed all the things that went with being analytical and thinking through how policy impacted everyone's everyday lives. I went from law school to being a lawyer. I specialize in employment law. And what I didn't realize was that there were so many aspects about employment law that were really driven by privacy. I was working on cases around employment monitoring, around the use of CCTV, whether or not you could use certain bits of evidence, whether people could say or do things at work. And ultimately, this really prompted an interest in privacy that I really began to focus on as privacy became a bigger topic. I took on more privacy issues and ultimately made the decision that this was an area I loved and wanted to specialize in.
I assume you ran out and got your CIPP of some sort.
Absolutely. So back when I was starting out in privacy, I wanted to know what to do. So I got my certifications. I ended up joining the CIPM development exam board because I wanted to understand how I could give back to the privacy community that had helped me grow. And I really just am a constant studier. You know that I like to nerd out on different privacy topics. I'm constantly teaching myself and just really staying on top of all the different things. And I think that's one of the reasons why I really enjoy privacy. It evolves so much and you think you've got it figured out, then something else happens and you have to refigure it out. Just going back to that analytical part of my brain.
Yeah. And so coming from the UK, these are pretty different cultures. In the UK, you guys have GDPR. And I'm curious, how has it been different coming to the States? Is there any kind of like compelling cultural difference about privacy? Have you seen more interest or less interest from businesses?
Yeah, so I think coming from the UK, there was so much that was entrenched in what I knew growing up that I never realized that there was such a difference. Until I got here, then I realized that actually there was a very different approach. In Europe, which is very rights driven, we know that privacy is a fundamental right. And it really goes with the fact that there's freedom and there's choice. You can choose what you share and what you don't share. It allows you to have the freedom to be yourself or to share what you want to with certain groups and individuals. And I think in the US, there's a different philosophy that comes with it not being rights driven, but being consumer driven. We think about the elements of data that we're trying to protect, and it usually comes with products or services. And I think there's also an element of secrecy that's involved there. The idea that privacy somehow means secrecy. And I've got nothing to hide, so why do I need privacy? When in fact, in Europe, we're thinking, why would I want to share this with this person? I want to be myself. And I think about how I am when I feel like I'm being monitored or someone's watching me or judging me. I behave very differently. I might not sing and dance if I think someone's watching me do that, but I would do that at home by myself in the privacy of my own home. And I think that was one of the things that I really noticed about that different outlook and having to explain what privacy meant to different individuals.
Yeah, Americans have definitely spent the better part of a couple of decades now being well trained that Google and Microsoft and Facebook and Amazon are all looking out for our best interests, and it's okay to exchange your data for access to services. And it's always such a slippery slope. Okay, so you can see my name and email. Oh, okay. It's okay if you see my phone number. You got my phone number, so I guess what does it matter if I tell you what state I'm in? And next thing, every technology company and every data broker has a full dossier on you, probably including things you didn't even know about. It's funny. I have definitely seen that similar difference between the UK and the US as well. When I talk with privacy pros in the UK, it is very much more a fundamental kind of approach. Whereas when you talk to American businesses, they're still often viewing privacy as something they have to do. Is there anything good about the US? Not the entire US, obviously, but is there anything about US as it relates to privacy that you have a positive thought about where something is better than in Europe?
Absolutely. And one of the questions you asked earlier was around why I moved to the States. And I think one of the reasons I moved to the States was, one, I wanted to travel abroad. I want to do something different. But the other thing about the US is the idea of innovation. Like, I was really drawn to the fact that in the US, we don't mind being a little bit crazy and trying new things. And we have that ability just to try and build. And I think in Europe, we've seen that with some regulation that's maybe hindered innovation a little bit. And so I think when it comes to privacy, we've seen the US really embrace privacy in different ways. When privacy is done really well, you can see how that impacts the user experience. When we think about all those different optionalities, it actually improves the customer delight when you're going onto a product and you have the ability to manage your data. I think that's a really great thing. And I think the other thing that US has is it has more teeth, because the US is definitely driven by economy and by business and by money. And we see that when it comes down to fines and penalties, those really large numbers, which are scarier than in Europe, I think that speaks to business in a different way. So I think the US really can, in fact, be very powerful when it comes to privacy regulation by helping to drive that innovation in a way that helps consumers feel they can manage their data better and give them choices.
Yes, and America is a very litigious society. I guess that's one great thing, is that businesses are already accustomed to the fact that the courts get involved in your business sometimes. So that's interesting. It's an interesting take. Okay, so we have some exciting things to talk about today. I know one of them is, I'm going to butcher this a little bit, so please correct me, but it just came out that CNIL, the French data protection authority under the GDPR, that they have now formed some sort of partnership or alliance with the state of California regarding CPRA and privacy rights. I was blown away. I've never heard of a state and a country getting together to cooperate on regulatory enforcement. I've heard that at the federal level, but never on the state level. And I'm just dying to know, what is your take on this? And what do you think is going to happen because of it? Does it mean anything, or is it a wait and see?
So I think it's all the above. I honestly was so excited by this. I studied law in France for the year. And so for me, this is a huge combination of things I love. I think we have the elements of recognizing that firstly, privacy isn't just state by state or country by country. It's truly international. We know that data transcends borders. And I think there's also this element that privacy has always been a team sport, and we're seeing the regulators get in on that too. By sharing information, by sharing approaches, they can hopefully actually help consumers and help businesses to do the right thing. I think one of the critiques we often hear about regulators is that they lack the information to do what businesses are trying to do. They don't understand how the technology works. They don't understand how businesses are trying to get involved. And so I think the more they share information and research and resources, the better it is for consumers and businesses to hopefully get better insights in what they need to do when they're trying to do the right thing. So I am really excited by this. I think there will be a lot of wait and see as this moves, but I think it's a very positive sign, and hope more regulators actually join forces with each other to help share information.
Rachel, did I ever share with you, there were some articles going around a couple years ago. I won't name names because I didn't check with him first, but he's a prominent privacy attorney. He had written a pretty terrifying prediction of what might happen to the internet as a result of data privacy. We're all familiar that China has basically got its own internet. It's very hard to do business there. Many of your sites are not accessible to Chinese people, or they're modified. I've always seen that as being a perfect example of a nation state that's created a walled garden for their technology. The author of this article was positing that because of GDPR, and because of the various federal regulations, and then because of thus far bumpy on and off again that Privacy Shield has provided for cross-border privacy regulations, his theory was that if we didn't get our act together and start working together across different countries and states, that companies would often have no choice but to have their European version of a web property, perhaps even a separate entity, and then their American version. Transmitting cross-border information is a big deal in privacy. And so how do you mitigate that? How do you make sure that big international companies are able to send data to their servers? And his whole take was this might be the thing that ends up causing us to have essentially separate internets. I'm curious, what do you think about that?
It's so interesting because we do see that there are these increasing data localization trends because of these different philosophies. We started by talking about the difference between the UK and the US and the different philosophical approaches. But if we had other countries in there, thinking about Germany, thinking about Australia, thinking about Latin America, again, we have all these different viewpoints because privacy isn't just about regulation, it's about culture, it's about your own perceptions, how you value privacy. And I think it becomes harder and harder to actually find an approach that works for everyone, or majority of the time works for everyone, unless you do have these international cooperations. And I think the ultimate decision really has to come down to what do consumers want, because if we can't agree, we are probably going to see increasing fragmentation. And I think we see that already with regulation between the different approaches. We have states in the US that have their own laws. We have them across Europe. And even within the States, we have industry and sectoral laws, and we have governing laws and AI laws, and we have social media laws. And it's really hard and complex. So I think it's such an interesting point around how do we try and make sure we have something that is good, does achieve privacy, but it's actually simple to use, and it's hard.
Yes, I agree with you 100%. My hope is that maybe this type of international cooperation between CNIL and California sets a precedent, and other countries join to work with California, other states start working with the regulators. And then who knows, maybe one of these days we get a federal privacy regulation and we can stop playing this game of whack-a-mole on a state-by-state basis. But you know what? That's a pretty awesome transition into one of the items I really wanted to talk about with you. And I think our audience will get a lot from hearing your thoughts. To better understand this hyper complex nature of privacy, you have to start with some basics, right? Mm-hmm. What is the state of privacy law in the US. Where are we? I mean, we've got state laws. We obviously don't have time to go through them all. That would take a day, a little bit like reading War and Peace. But when you think about the big differences, what are the big differences between the EU frameworks, the US frameworks, and do you see anything significant happening between federal and state?
Great question. And we're recording this on a Thursday. And of course, my answer could be different on a Friday, because that's what we're seeing from a Privacy Pro perspective. Every day feels like a new headline. And you're right, we have all these different state laws and we have these different sectoral and industry laws. I think the other aspects of this that really complex the framework for different companies is the fact that there's all these other laws that go into it. We touched upon AI. We have the idea that if you're a parent whose child is using social media, there might be consent obligations involved there. So I think that's a huge difference from the EU, where we see the GDPR is actually an all-encompassing framework. Does it do everything? No, but does it help to offer a solution to most problems? Potentially, yes, because it applies to private companies, it applies to public organizations. It doesn't matter what your thresholds are. It doesn't matter what kind of data you're processing. There's no revenue exemptions. And I think that's very different from the US, where we see that, yes, there are these state laws, but there's also these exemptions too. And then you add in the layer of all these other laws that go in, that jigsaw is just very hard to follow. And I think what we see from a Privacy Pro perspective is very challenging to operationalize while trying to do the right thing.
Yeah. That makes me think of politicians are notorious for doing a very good job of looking out for their own interests and ensuring that they have the ability to reach consumers. We have these laws against SMS spam and email spam. And of course, all of those laws have carve-outs that say, if it's a politician doing it, there's no obligation. I really do wonder how far, if we get a federal privacy regulation coming in, how much kind of constituency service are they going to be doing to try and carve out exemptions for various industries that they protect? It'll be really interesting to see whether we have the same willpower that Europe does to really decide that this is a critical and important thing. On the federal privacy law side of things, do you see the federal privacy law as having, or the absence thereof, as having any kind of impacts on how the rest of the world views America or interacts with America?
I think so. I tend to be glass half full. I try and look at it from a positive outlook. But I get nervous about the federal privacy law because I see the starts and stops. And I think that's really disruptive for privacy pros, for the global economy, and really trying to understand how we can set better regulation and governance around something that is so valuable. The US right now is an outlier for not having this federal or this comprehensive law. We see that there's the GDPR, we know that there's the LGPD, and many countries also have a national privacy law in place. And none of them are perfect. There's many criticisms about each of them. But I think what really does signal to outside of the US is the fact that there isn't that baseline. And I think that's definitely a concern. But at the same time, from seeing how the federal laws have been drafted, we can see there's a lot of contention there. And I think one of the key elements is trying to decide what are the concessions we're willing to make, because privacy means different things to different people. So how do we try and find something that best resonates for the majority of the people that we can get that passed?
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens. This is just a topic that gets me so heated, honestly, because we read like a month or two ago, we saw in the news that they had discovered Chinese monitoring equipment in cranes on the ports, on American ports. Nothing bad had happened, but there's a lot of question about why that collection system was even enabled. We've seen the balloons flying over the country and everybody getting excited about that. We've seen TikTok coming under fire and even having an order that mandates it change hands or stop doing business here. Do you think that those serve as conflicting indicators, right? Because on one sense, we're telling other nation states that we protect our people's data vis-a-vis like the TikTok regulation, right? We don't want our children to be taught and monitored by another nation. But on the other side of it, we have so much exposure as a nation. There is so much data. Does it even matter? Does it even matter at all if we go out and pass great regulations if we still have nation states who are able to bypass all of those rules because they have access to our society through other platforms? I'm just curious what your take is on that.
Oh, wow. That's a great question. And I think the answer is yes, it does matter. I think the degree to which it matters, again, comes down to your different viewpoints on privacy. Do you have secrets or do you want to have those freedoms? I think we've seen a lot of movement around how we see a lot more regulation around health information because we know that's something that's very important to people. They want to be able to go to their doctors and they want to seek medical treatment and they don't want to see the repercussions of potentially criminal actions for seeking medical advice. We're also seeing that there's a lot of concern around children are behaving because of what they see on social media and how parents can help govern that. But I think there's the other element of the fact that we want to make sure that we can protect what information is shared, not just the information that we choose to share, but the information we don't know is being shared. So we see a lot around broker activity. So I think there's a lot that we can do internally to make sure we are giving ourselves better frameworks and better ability to sleep at night without freaking out over what may happen. But it does obviously tie into a larger national security concern that I think we're starting to see get a lot of traction in political mechanisms.
I'm personally hopeful that this kind of scare that they have around China will be the thing that finally causes them to push forward on privacy regulations. My theory is that it has less to do with Congress suddenly having a particularly strong grasp of privacy regulation, but rather that they're becoming aware of the value of the data that consumers create when they use applications and services and as they drive around town. And they're thinking about how to guard that. And of course, they're gonna try and hit some of this stuff with a hammer, and it's going to be about firewalls and better security mechanisms. But as we know, the best defense against hackers and against theft of data is just not collecting that much to start with. So we'll see. It's going to be an exciting, I think, next couple of months and see what happens with APRA or not APRA. I keep mixing up the acronyms, but it is APRA now. It's APRA now.
Yeah,
yes.
But any federal privacy law, because we might be back in this position again next year, having the same conversation. And it's good to see that there is traction. And I agree with you. I think there is that discussion around sensitive data that is different now from how it was a couple of years ago. And my hope is we're at that tipping point where we can't ignore this any longer. We have to take action. At least that's my hope. So fingers crossed.
We would all love to see a federal regulation. And when you think about what a federal law might look like in the United States, we've now had 2 different regulations that have been brought forward. I'm curious, when you evaluate APRA, the most recent attempt at privacy regulations, what's your take on how that compares with the GDPR? Is it strong? Is it weak? Is it leaving a lot of gaps where European companies might, or European data subjects might still have concern about sharing data with American companies?
I think it does give Europeans a lot more comfort because there's that blanket protection and it sets to do a lot of the same things that are really being driven at by the GDPR, trying to protect individuals' data. I think there are definitely gaps and I think there are certainly nuances, and maybe in some respects the way that the APRA has been drafted might in fact in some areas be better than the GDPR because it has been written more recently. The GDPR was drafted more than 8 years ago now. So there's elements around APRA that foresee technology use in a way that perhaps the GDPR didn't. But I think the other elements of APRA that are a little bit of a concern is trying to understand that preemption obligation. At what point does a federal law govern, and at what point do the states have the ability to intervene? And I think that's maybe one of the biggest challenges I see compared with the GDPR, where we know that there's that national framework that really should have a lot of uniformity and drive consistency.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating to watch the negotiations because if the federal government would have gotten some privacy regulations on the books a couple of years ago, preemption wouldn't really necessarily even be a conversation. But the states all made their own laws because they're like, federal government's not doing anything about this, and now we have to. And they give their citizens rights and duties to the businesses. And it would be a little difficult to have a new federal privacy regulation that comes in and says, we're taking away some of those rights that you had last week.
Yeah.
But don't worry, it's all better in some way, shape, or form. And I think what's fascinating about this whole thing is that they have to get buy-in from the state, from the representatives of the states, meaning that the representatives who represent their constituents in those states have to come forward and vote on this bill. And so not having done this 3-4 years ago has made this far harder because now they've got to try and get all of California to, or the representatives from California to say, yes, I can get on board with this preemption over CPRA because it has the following subjects. Ironically, I'm guessing may become a problem is you might end up with states that have put the time and effort into building really compelling privacy laws. They might actually be the ones that end up blocking the federal law.
Yeah.
So,
and I think that's what we've seen with California and its view on APRA. And they've had some really compelling viewpoints about why APRA shouldn't be in place and why federal law should work with state laws. As an example, California has under the California laws, it includes employees. And that's definitely different from other states that don't include employees. And so we can see how California and the GDPR actually align. And that may be one of those concession points around how do we get this over the line? Do we remove that right in California? Do we try and get everyone else to jump on this? Or do we just agree that actually these two laws should coincide together because that's what makes a smoother path? So I think there's that element, but then there's all the other nuances that go into it and where that discussion gets even more lively. Do you give everyone the same rights or do you have to live with something that isn't perfect just because you want to have that privacy equality across the whole country?
Yeah. It seems like that's the common refrain for everything that we do these days is, guess we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah.
There's a lot of waiting in data privacy.
There is. It's a lot of waiting and hurried action very quickly afterwards.
Right. We all enjoyed California in the summer of 2023. They said, hey, the enforcement date is July. And then 2 weeks before the enforcement date, never mind, we decided not to do that. So there seems to be a lot of willingness to shift gears. And then for privacy pros and companies like ours who are in the privacy world, there is a lot of, oh my God, we've got 2 weeks to figure out this regulation and get things in place for it. I mean, LGPD, their president put that into effect with 1 or 2 weeks notice. It was something incredibly short.
That's right. And we see this with a lot of other laws where they come through and you're thinking, oh, that's going to be at least 6 months. And hang on, actually, that's much, much quicker. What we've also seen is, I think last year, India passed its regulation. It went through really quickly. And then we were waiting for that effective date. And I don't believe we've got that yet because it's still pending Indian national elections. So there's a lot of you're driving into action, then you have to wait and slow down. Then you're running again, then you have to slow down. And so again, that's another operational challenge for privacy pros. We're having some kind of baseline would be so helpful for them.
Yeah, I would be remiss if I didn't say something about Osano, but this really highlights why it is that having a product or a set of products or a platform that are not just tools for a privacy professional, but that actually provide guidance and have opinions becomes more important because there's just, you never know when it's going to happen that there are 4 new laws that go into effect all in the same day and privacy pros are scrambling. This is always going to be something that's going to be an ongoing challenge is bandwidth. And so buy Osano. All right. I promise I won't try and sell our products on the podcast anymore. So when you think about the business community in America, we have a pretty fierce independence in America. That's what we're known for. We are the people who sailed across the ocean to go avoid taxation that we didn't like. So I'm really curious, when you think about the business community in the United States, how has their perspective evolved? You've been doing this in privacy years, you've been doing this forever. I'm really curious how you've seen the business community's viewpoints on privacy shift over the last few years.
I remember a few years ago when I was talking with American clients or American partners in the privacy community, and there was this sense of the GDPR, and it comes with that obligatory eye roll of, oh, why do we have to do this? All they see are the dollar signs and the resource constraints. And I think what we've started seeing now is that actually privacy reaps benefits for business, because the cleaner your data, the more you can do with it, the more transparent you can be, the more people trust you, the more that you share, the more people actually want to find out about you. And so I think there's been elements where there have been those moments where people have almost had to see the results where doing it this way didn't cause a massive drop in revenue. Doing it this way actually improved the quality of our relationships, but it has taken time to get there. And I think the other element that's maybe been a bit of a learning curve for me is that UK citizen moving to the States was really trying to understand that why for privacy. And I think you and I have had conversations about when I was growing up in the west coast of Scotland, we just could not talk about religion outside of the home. It was one of those subjects that was very politically divisive. Growing up with grandparents who suffered through terrible things during World War II, and then also seeing what was happening with the Troubles in Northern Ireland, there were certainly things you could not talk about with your religious faith. And I think there has been that education of really understanding from a business community, why is this so important? Why do people care about this? And I think that has also helped just seeing the way the world's evolving, understanding that why, but also getting to that place of how has been a lot easier for companies to navigate.
Yeah, I know we hear a lot about brand trust as being one of the key areas that companies are focusing on. In today's economy, although the S&P is hitting record highs, what we've definitely seen across industry is tightening of the belts, pulling back on more experimental spend, like experimental marketing programs. It's been really fun to watch some of the brands that we've worked with over time really start embracing this concept that brand trust is almost an immeasurable but highly impactful thing. And that data privacy is one of the key ways you can increase that trust. And the end result being that, yes, marketers perhaps have less ability to track, but if you're countering that with this great spin on your brand, you might actually see that things are better because suddenly people are more likely to fill out that form or call your reps or chat with you on your website. People often discount how much trust plays a big role on the internet.
It's true. And I think there's always this perception that privacy pros are the station of no, that any compliance function, we're going to say no to every request. And I think what businesses have learned, and certainly my experience, is that we're not trying to be the party poopers. We're actually trying to get an invite to the party planning committee. We want to help you organize that party. Don't have the party without us, invite us, but also we can help you plan it. And I think that makes a huge difference for companies when they realize that you can actually handle compliance and achieve those business goals in the same way. Trust, it doesn't have to be one or the other. You can build trust and still build your business. I think companies are seeing that with really smart marketing. They're seeing that across the markets and actually having a bit more faith that investing in privacy is really an investment in the business strategy overall.
Yeah, and it's also a great defensive mechanism, right? Your board is wondering about audits and about the potential of litigation, and this is one more thing that you can do to reduce risk. We talked about EU, America. We've talked about the federal privacy regulations in America. We've touched on Brazil, talked about Scotland. Mm-hmm. So let's go global, right? When you think about a lot of these businesses, the growth pattern for most businesses is that they begin in one country. They figure out product market fit. They figure out how to sell that product or service. And then one of the major expansion avenues is to begin going international. So they're going to start opening up a European office, and they're going to have brand advertising and marketing in Europe to try and attract customers there, or perhaps Australia or New Zealand or Brazil. But when you think about companies who are in that stage of trying to expand internationally, or perhaps just trying to figure out how to really do international right, even if they've already done it, I'm really interested to hear, what do you think of as being the biggest hurdles that businesses are facing when they're thinking about that international expansion?
Yeah, I think it comes down to the why and how, because it really comes down to understanding the culture and the customer. If you know why something is important, it's far more likely you're going to get language that is a good market fit. And I've seen companies that have just approached compliance in a very unique way that doesn't really fit with the market. They think, I'm going to add an opt-in box and that's me and I'm done. But actually what they don't understand is that with explanation and transparency, they're far more likely to get people checking that opt-in box. So I think that's been a really hard thing for companies that are trying to think about their expansion. How do I actually do this in a way that's friendly? Europeans love innovation and they love friendly designs and they love to see the language. It doesn't have to be just about boring check marks and check boxes and notices. They can be done in a very cool way. And I think that's where a lot of companies, they feel that the compliance part is actually the resource drain rather than that business innovation. So when it comes to consent, when it comes to putting your notices up, be creative, be thoughtful, and really just try and make sure that you're mindfully designing your program for its intended audience.
So that is fantastic feedback. And what's your betting? If you were a betting gal, what are the odds that in the next, say, 12 months that we have agreement upon a federal privacy regulation? Even if it hasn't yet been signed by the president, what are your odds on that?
I don't think it's going to pass. I would love it to, but I just don't have the confidence that it will. I think there's too much going on this year and we're just too far away from it right now. I am pleased to see that there's a lot of energy and motivation and desire to get this in place. I just don't think we're ready for it. But what I do think will happen is I think we're still going to see that patchwork of state laws emerge. I think we're going to see more regulation. And hopefully that becomes more of a tipping point for the next time the federal law argument comes around, that it just becomes a natural choice. So that's my prediction.
All right. So in a year, we'll have you back on the pod and we'll see how we did. I am a 50% better on this one. I feel like we've heard enough discussion of children's privacy. Yep. And for some reason, if it's children's data, politicians seem more inclined to move. And so I'm cautiously optimistic that it will happen. So in a year, we'll revisit this and we'll see. And I will bet you a nice lunch somewhere.
Perfect. We've got lunch writing on it. I think you're right around kids. Kids is the one thing that everyone can agree on. We need to protect children. And I think how we do it, that's where we're going to start seeing more discussion. Maybe that's the tipping point, but we'll have our lunch next year and discuss.
Thank you very much for joining, Rachael. We are delighted that you are at our party at Osano and really appreciate you joining the podcast. Rachael is an amazing human being and a real wealth of knowledge on privacy, and very grateful that I get to have her here with us on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So if you have just started tuning into the podcast, make sure and go back and listen to our first couple episodes. We have some very exciting guests planned in the near future that I think you're going to want to tune in for. I will see you on the next episode. Have a wonderful day. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Privacy Insider Podcast. You can find a full transcript of this episode and any show notes at osano.com. That's www.osano.com. And while you're there, get access to an excerpt of my book, The Privacy Insider: How to Embrace Data Privacy and Join the Next Wave of Trusted Brands, which is now available on Amazon for purchase. Until next month, take care. And remember, data privacy is a fundamental human right, y'all.